So Rich, in his generosity, keeps referring to me as, no, sorry, it's fine, as an important author. Sometimes I think historians, we just make stuff up. So I'm not sure how important it is, but it does, I think, at times what we do intersects with current debates, and that's why I find it to be most interesting. So when you all go to Gettysburg, you're going to go to the visitor center, and the new visitor center is a result in many ways of the work that historians have done over the last 2 decades. Because the old visitor center, any of you ever been to Gettysburg before they put the new one up? So most of you. So you go to the old visitor center, the electronic map, that kind of stuff. Yeah. Well, that visitor center was didn't really tell a story, didn't really have any interpretation or analysis, and the new one does in some important ways. And they've really thought through the new one in some very intelligent ways. And some of the National Park Service people I know, when they were telling me when they were putting it up, it's just really impressed with the kind of research they were doing. So when you go to that, I think you'll be impressed with how they've thought through it. So the work I do deals with, lately has been on the Underground Railroad over the last few years. And when I went to Gettysburg College, I interviewed there in 2001. And I told them if they wanted me to do anything connected with the Civil War, I wasn't interested. They had other Civil War people. And they said, no, we've got big name scholars who do that. And a little while after I was there, a few years after I was there, Dickinson College, about 40 minutes up the road, called me and said, hey, we want you to do a presentation, a talk on the Underground Railroad in South Central Pennsylvania. And I knew what they were thinking. I think, okay, so there's this new professor, this black guy at Gettysburg College. He does African American history. He must do the Underground Railroad in the Civil War. And my work was all 17th, 18th century, early 19th century, and maybe up to like 1820 or so. And so I told him, I said, I'm not interested. I don't want to do the Civil War. I don't know anything about South Central Pennsylvania. My work is mostly in New England. I don't know the Underground Railroad. I don't know that history. They said, we'll give you $200. I said, sure. So that's what motivates historians, more so than the more intellectual pursuit sometimes. But it has evolved into a very interesting project for me. So I've gotten connected with the Civil War stuff and debates in ways that I had not anticipated. And part of in doing that paper for Dickinson College, I thought about, well, the Underground Railroad, and when you think about African Americans in the North and black towns, there's been a lot of work on the mechanics of the Underground Railroad. Who did what, when, where, how did it work, and all that kind of stuff. And I wasn't about to get into all that because plenty of other people know more about it than me. So I tried to think about how do we conceptualize the Underground Railroad? What's its place in American history beyond the Follow the Drinking War and beyond Harriet Tubman, beyond kind of the exciting stories that are really cool that we all like, but is it anything more than that? So that led me to think about how these men and women who are running away from slavery are transgressing certain boundaries of geography, of law, and space. And so that's kind of what this is about. So, and it connects to, I think, how we think about the Civil War. So there's this guy named John Sims, an African-American artist and mathematician from Florida, who wanted to come to Gettysburg College in 2004, and he wanted to display a Confederate flag hanging from a noose. And he was going to build it on a 13-foot wooden gallows and put it in the center of campus outside, and it caused a big ruckus, and they got death threats, and eventually had to be moved inside to this. He refused to come because this wasn't what he had envisioned, although he let us put it in the exhibition. They had a metal detector you had to go into. And our art gallery is small, and there was about 1,000 people lined up. It's the biggest art exhibition they've ever had by a long shot. The Sons of Confederate Veterans were threatening to protest. It ended up being like 5 elderly men in Confederate uniforms and huge Confederate flags outside on the street, which they had closed down. So it was quite controversial. They had a flag fly over our graduation with a banner towed by a plane with something about the Sons of Confederate Veterans. And So it went on for quite a while, got some national press, but I would argue that it ultimately centered on what the Civil War still means for Americans today. Now, John Sims eventually did get to display his flag. I believe this is in Tallahassee. I have to look it up. Somewhere in Florida, where on the gallows like he had originally envisioned. And actually, when the Africana Studies program is when that brought him to Gettysburg, I had said, let's put it on a flatbed truck and drive it around the rotary in the center of town. They didn't like that.
Have you heard about the flag in Florida that flies over I-75?
No.
It's huge.
Confederate flag? Battle flag? No, I have not
It's
heard of that.
extremely large, and it just flies. It waves over the entire state. My dad told me about that.
Do you know who put it up? Is it just some private?
The Sons of Confederate Flag.
Really? Okay, interesting. I find all that Confederate battle flag stuff fascinating, so I did another paper on that a couple of years ago. But and some of you may know the history behind this, that ultimately the Confederate battle flag, the history was revised, and the history of the Civil War was revised. And in that revision, and ironically, because often people like Rich and I and historians today get accused of being revisionist, but if you look at how they wrote the history in the late 19th, early 20th, and mid-20th century, that's when they were revising history. And they revised it in such a way that slavery was depicted as benign, slave owners were generally benign, and the slave owner who was abusive was an aberration. The Confederacy was really fighting for states' rights and things like that, and we'll get back to that. So ultimately, I think it's about how space. Oh yeah, and this was the name of it, proper way to hang a Confederate flag. That space and law is a way to think about how to reinsert African Americans into the story of the Civil War in ways that perhaps our mainstream histories have not, after the historians of the late 19th and early 20th century revised the history of the Civil War. Because in that revision, they really minimized African Americans' role in it, whether as slaves, slavery. And so black people, in many ways, disappeared from what the Civil War was about. And some of you may know, Virginia in 2010, they have a Confederate History Month. Was there anybody here from Virginia? I don't think so. They have a Confederate History Month they celebrate. And when Wilder was the governor, the celebration was kind of, it wasn't really publicized at the state level. The new governor decided to reinvigorate Confederate History Month, and so in 2010 when he made his proclamation, he did so, but he left out any mention of slavery or African Americans, and he got all kinds of criticism, so he reissued another sort of proclamation to reinvigorate, and that time he included slavery as one of the causes of the Civil War. But I think his initial, and to his credit, he responded quickly, but his initial proclamation, where it was forgotten, I think it's a result of this kind of revision that minimized the role of black people in the war. So when you go to the Gettysburg Visitor Center, you can see what you think as far as how they've done this. So historians today have, as you may know, you'd be hard-pressed to find an academic historian or professional historian who would not agree that slavery was the primary cause of the Civil War. I think there are a few academic historians who would say, oh no, it's about states' rights or tariffs or other things. You know, I think prominent historians who would still make that argument. I think they've been gone from the scene for quite some time. Although when I first taught at the University of Alabama, the guy I replaced, I went to his office and he had left a bunch of little Confederate flags for me. I think he still was in that mindset. That was 12 years ago. But we still say, this is my critique of historians today. Historians today, if you read the scholarship, will say slavery was the primary cause of the Civil War. And I don't know if you read the intro to that book that I edited with Good Warm War, the intro that I wrote, where I talk about my son going up on the tower at Gettysburg, and we had this debate several years ago because when we went up there, I was telling him, I said, Isaac, just think none of this happens without African Americans being here. And my own son, my own flesh and blood, said, well, it was about more than that. It was states' rights. And I wanted to throw him off the tower.
That's on tape, you know.
I didn't throw him off the tower. But the way I put it to him was, and the way I put it to my students, if no black people ever come to these shores, there's no slaves, no Africans, no African Americans, we don't have the American Civil War. Maybe we have something else, but our particular history, this American Civil War, doesn't happen. So I don't know how you can make the argument that slaves or slavery wasn't the primary cause. But nonetheless, we still say historians, slavery caused the Civil War. We don't say slaves caused the Civil War. We still think of it as an institution, as a political, economic, social institution pushed the nation to war. And where I want to challenge historians to think about this is, well, what about the decisions, the individual decisions, and the cumulative effect of those decisions that black men and women made, whether they're slaves or free? And can we think about a way to conceptualize it where we say African Americans, individuals, people, were one of the primary causes of the Civil War? Now, I'm not saying, my caveat, I'm not saying that African Americans by themselves caused the Civil War, because the reality is it was the institution as well. I mean, it was things beyond just their individual decisions. But what I'm arguing is they have still been left out of the story in terms of their agency and the decisions that they made. So that's what this argument connects to and deals with popular conceptions of how law works in particular spaces as a way to uncover the effect that individual decisions by black people in the antebellum era had on the course of the nation. And if you have questions, feel like Bernard, feel free to jump in or stop me, or if anything I'm saying is not making sense. In some ways, what I'm arguing here is not new. Albert Bushnell was a historian from Harvard over a century ago. He said the Underground Railroad was the opportunity for bold and adventurous, had the excitement of piracy, the secrecy of burglary, the daring of insurrection, to the pleasure of relieving the poor Negro's suffering. It added the triumph of snapping one's fingers at the slave catcher, developed coolness, indifference to danger, and quickness of resource. So it's a great hook, because it's got all this exciting stuff, but I'd say it's more than that. And a guy named Herbert Aptheker in 1945 made a similar argument. I don't know, so you all didn't read the article Crossing Freedom's Fault Line, I'm guessing. Yeah. Well, I'm trying to finish the revisions to that so that Civil War History Journal can publish it with their Emancipation Proclamation issue coming out like next January, February. But that's what some of this is building toward. And this adventure that Bushnell describes results from what I'd call an ideological, legal, geographical, and political fault line. So, in thinking about how law works in particular spaces, people attach certain beliefs about what the law can and can't do in particular places and spaces. So, for instance, this is an aerial view of the Arlington Cemetery. So there's certain things in that space that we would say are appropriate and certain things that are not appropriate. For instance, if you're going to take the Arlington Cemetery, put a soccer field in it, we'd say, well, you can't do that because we have a certain conception of what it's supposed to be. Even if there was empty space, if there weren't tombstones there, but surrounded by tombstones, we'd say, well, we'd be uneasy with that. And particularly if you got people playing soccer in that space. I grew up a military kid playing soccer overseas, so that's this example. So certain relationships and functions of relationships can be carried out in a particular space, certain kinds of activities in this space can be carried out, certain other activities not carried out in that space. So, and you could extend that to a host of other things, of ways that we conceptualize space. And so most antebellum white Americans, including many who are anti-slavery, and I don't know to what degree you all discuss the differences between anti-slavery and abolition. Does that come up?
Yeah.
Okay, well, you could be anti-slavery and not be abolitionist, as some of you probably know. there's a whole range, there's a wide spectrum of anti-slavery and abolitionism. So many white Northerners who are anti-slavery don't have any problem with the functions and relationship and activities of slavery going on in the southern space. It's appropriate in that space. They don't believe it's appropriate in the northern spaces. You know, some and other anti-slavery people who are more active abolitionists like Garrison, white Northerners would think that slavery is not appropriate anywhere. But most white Northerners who are anti-slavery, they're okay with, kind of like Lincoln in some ways. I mean, Lincoln condemning slavery, but he can live with it existing in the South, even though he wants it to expire at some point. So maps, one of the things I've started to analyze in this project, and how maps signify how we think about space. So changing conceptions of space. So this is a map from 1690. So what's this a map of? The Northeast, yeah. So you can see Cape Cod there, right? And Virginia. Yeah, colonial America. Right? But you know, the way they signified space here, it's divided loosely by some of the colonies and this is a Dutch map. But these maps, even though they're made not by the British, they are influencing, they're published and used by the Brits and the French and colonial Americans. So these maps demark boundaries and space in a different way. So we think about maps as representative of how people are thinking about who owns what and who controls what territory. And then this map is 1755, so you can start to see some differences, right? You know, there's some boundaries being drawn there, some further demarcation. Part of this, well, and you'll see this in some of the ones coming up. Part of the reason these boundaries are extending is because of how they conceive of Native Americans not really having legal or political rights to territory, so therefore colonial divisions extended infinitely to the west at this time. But even here you can see, you know, so we can see it's becoming more coherent, looks something more like what we're familiar with. This is 1777. So it's starting to look more like the states. And what we have to be careful of, though, is not reading a North-South Division here. We can see it. This is what's going to become the Mason-Dixon Line. There's no Mason-Dixon Line. Well, actually, yeah, there is a Mason-Dixon Line. Mason-Dixon are commissioned in 1767. But this line doesn't demark south as in slave and north as in free. Right? So we might think of it that way, especially all of us, all of you, with backgrounds in history and slave and free. But that's not how they're thinking about 1777. Or even this is 1784. And you can see these westward extensions, but again, there's not the neat North-South Division. And certainly not in this one, also 1784, where it's more of a broader view, almost an imperial view, which distinguishes the 13 provinces. So why in these kind of maps might there not be, as people in the late 18th century are reading these maps, why might they not be thinking about it in terms of a north-south slave-free division? Yeah. Yeah. Slavery is throughout the colonies. Massachusetts abolishes, well, okay, so historians like to say Massachusetts abolished slavery in 1780. I found a few cases of people still being enslaved in 1784 because there are a couple of legal cases, so they didn't have a sharp demarcation, but it's starting to disappear. Vermont, New Hampshire, Vermont didn't have slavery in New Hampshire. It's for the most part a non-factor except for Portsmouth. But certainly New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and other parts of the North, there isn't that distinction because, as you said, slavery exists in all of these. So when slaves run away in the 1780s or 1790s, or even early 19th century, they're not crossing any significant legal boundaries. Right? So when a slave runs away from Massachusetts to Rhode Island, or vice versa, and I'll give you an example of that, not as big a deal as slaves running away would become. So there's no significant sort of legal or conceptual dissonance with the notion of Southerners chasing after runaways and Northerners chasing after runaways. And I needed to make a definition earlier on here. So what terminology do you all use for runaway slaves? Runaways, fugitives, criminals? Well, so, I mean, does it ever come up when you're teaching your kids, you talk about runaway slaves or Harriet Tubman? So what terminology do you use? Runaway. What, absconding? Illegal immigrants, you know, because they are technically illegal, right? Immigrating from one place to another. But I think the terminology needs to be a bit more precise, and I'm not, this wasn't a setup. I don't know if you ever do this to your students. You elicit answers, and then then you show them why that was the wrong answer. Because this, in historians in the literature, by academic historians, that's how we say runaway or fugitives. And I would argue we need more precise terminology, because and historians have known this for quite some time, that African Americans are running away from their owners all the time. But most of them are running away not for permanent freedom. They're not doing the Frederick Douglass thing. Right? They're running, well, what's your back here?
Sometimes they would visit family members on a plantation, like Frederick Douglass' mom used to walk 12 miles every night to go visit him.
Yeah. So technically, she's running away. Slaves often called it staying out. Sometimes, or if they were they used it as a negotiating tool. I think that's probably the most common, to visit family and relatives. But often a negotiating tool if they felt like their owner promised them time off and then withdrew that, or was going to make them work on a Sunday, then they might just take off as a form of protest. There's a risk in that, right? Because when they come back, they may face severe punishment. But often that negotiating tactic works to some extent. So there's a variety of reasons, but most runaways, and John Hope Franklin, Warren Schwenninger, in their book Runaway Slaves, talk about this. They do a great job in explaining this. Most of them are staying out, or maybe there's a maroon community like in a Great Dismal Swamp or something like that. But I would say that the slaves who are seeking escape permanently, that's how we should refer to them, as escaping slaves, because they're escaping the institution. They're not trying to negotiate, they're not just trying to see family, they want to leave permanently. So that's terminology I try to use in my work to make the distinction. So escaping slaves are not causing any huge problems. Slaves who run away from Alabama to Mississippi are crossing a legal line, a state line, but they're not embroiling courts or newspapers, street and town halls. Pursuing one's property in this fashion fit in what Blackstone, the legal commentator, the English legal commentator, had a significant influence on American law, called recaption. And his formulation of recaption was essentially that if your horse ran away to some other neighbor's property, you didn't have to get legal permission from the justice of the peace or the sheriff to go onto somebody else's property to get your horse. You could just go get it. And so slaves who are running away, staying out, that's what they fit into. The question is, when escaping slaves, does recaption apply for them? And that's where it becomes much more thorny. Because everybody's okay with this notion of recaption. For instance, Tom and Susan, a married couple, in 1797 they run away from their master in Rhode Island to Massachusetts, and Tom finds work breaking horses near Worcester, and Susan is working as a nurse in a smallpox hospital. Their owner comes after them. Their owner's son tracks them down, finds them, They're hiding near Worcester, probably with the help of free black Northerners, which will come back to these black communities in the North and their importance. The owner says that federal law is clear against any person either concealing or harboring fugitives. Attempts to pursue the case in court. I've never been able to find the end result of this case in court documents. So what Tom and Susan do is nearly identical to what many escaping slaves do after 1820. But when Tom and Susan do this in 1797, there's no legal uproar, there's no sectional issues. Rhode Island doesn't threaten to leave the Union if they don't go get their runaway slaves who are escaping to Massachusetts, because slavery is still a significant part of Rhode Island's economy in the port towns and social and political life. Massachusetts, it's a non-factor if it exists at all. I don't know of any slaves still in Massachusetts in 1797. There's no geographic divides. Rhode Islanders don't perceive their way of life to be at risk like white Southerners would in the antebellum era. And it doesn't lead to any deep divisions in identity, where Rhode Islanders, they don't see themselves significantly different than Massachusetts people, as some white Southerners would start to see themselves from white Northerners in the antebellum era. By contrast, 50 years later, in 1847, you have Hester, who runs from Hagerstown, Maryland to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which nowadays is a straight shoot up route, Interstate 81. It's about an hour drive. It causes a riot in Carlisle. 28 free black men are put in jail. There's a court trial, receives a lot of publicity. One person dies because when Hester is taken into prison, she's captured in Carlisle, and when she's held there, the free black community burst into the courtroom. They take her out of the courtroom. They put Hester and her son in a cart that's driven off. The slave owners, hired men, are pursuing the cart. Then there's a crowd of free black men and women who are chasing the slave owners, who are chasing Hester, and they're throwing bricks and whatever they can at these slave catchers. And one of the owners, I can't remember the owner or his son, is hit in the brick and eventually dies a few weeks later. And one of the lawyers in the trial who's prosecuting Hester and the 28 black men who were in prison and charged with helping her, the lawyer says that if this isn't resolved, and if the jury doesn't find these men guilty, it's going to lead to a civil war that will light up the land, he says, in 1847. And he wasn't the only one who was predicting that this would lead to war. David Walker predicted in 1829 that if the nation didn't resolve slavery, it would lead to war. So what changes between 1797, you have thousands of runaways who are going from one state to another, and it's not a big deal. In 1847, when you have runaways who are going from the south to the north, and it's causing incredible dissension. Well, what I would argue is they're crossing a fault line. So a fault line, this is San Andreas Fault, which we've mostly heard of. So I don't know, any of you geographers or geologists in training? No background on that? Good, so I can say whatever I want, and you'll know if I'm right or wrong. So this is an aerial shot of San Andreas Fault Line. And the way fault lines work, as my understanding, is two geological plates are in tension. They're pushing against one another. When the force becomes too great, you get an explosion of tension or an earthquake. And so I think conceptually, maybe we can apply this, why I call my article Crossing Freedom's Fault Line, because the Mason-Dixon line, and then as a representative of the division between North and South, represents different conceptions of what freedom meant, for whom freedom was meant, and these conceptions start to coalesce and sharpen in the mid-19th century, so from about 1810, 1820 on. In fact, so I did a search in the American Historical Newspapers database and did several searches and tried to find all the cases of newspapers that reported on runaway, fugitive, escaping slaves, whatever label you would give them, prior to 1810. And there's only 2 cases of fugitive slaves who are running away where it's reported as a problem. And in one of those, they're running from Florida to, I can't recall where they're running to. They're running from Florida to Spanish Florida, and another one they're running from Louisiana into Texas, where there's a Spanish governor in charge of part of Texas. And in both cases, these slave owners and their political representatives are complaining that the federal government isn't doing anything about these slaves from running away. They're not going after the Spanish government. Yeah.
Where's the line of Florida, the Spanish Florida, and the United States Florida?
Where was the line exactly? I don't know. South of Tallahassee is all I can tell you. But yeah, and it's a good question because I'm not sure how far they're going in this. But these political officials are seeing this as a problem, and one of them, the governor of Louisiana, well, eventually becomes governor of Louisiana. He even says if the federal government doesn't do something about this, then we slave owners are going to take this into our own hands, and it's going to cause a war. But he's talking about a war between the U.S. and Spain, which never happens. But you have these guys sort of foreshadowing what's going to happen when the federal government doesn't do anything from the Southern perspective later in the antebellum era. But part of my point is, it's coming back to, it's not a big deal. It's not getting wide press coverage. It's not stirring up the sentiments of white Americans like it would after 1810, particularly after 1820. You start to see a steady increase in the number of times it starts popping up, and it's about escaping slaves going from southern states north of the Mason-Dixon line. So the Mason-Dixon line, this is the Mason-Dixon line. Okay, this is in Adams County where Gettysburg is. Can you see it? Can you see the Mason-Dixon line there? I think it's just behind that house. Actually, one of the high school students I used to work with has a farm on it, and he's offered to take me there and show me, because the markers that Mason and Dixon put in, many of them are still there. These concrete markers that have like a Pennsylvania seal on one side, the Maryland seal on the other. So he's got a few on his property that he's going. And he sent me photos of it, so he's going to let me go there. That's not going to be on your tour, though. That would be quite a ways and out of the way and a hike. Well, this is what it looks like from the air. So part of this, so these are the property boundaries as farmers are clearing their land, but they've got to stop where the Maryland-PA border is. So the Mason-Dixon line, in terms of geography and topography and law, sort of comes into focus over time as farmers are clearing their land. And again, I'm trying to use this as sort of an analogy where for many white Americans and black Americans, this sharp divide, unlike the earlier maps, where there's not a clearest north-south divide, it comes into focus over time, and part of the reason it comes into focus is because of these runaway slaves. It's not the only reason, but it's part of the reason, because they're crossing this line, and it's causing a problem because of lack of enforcement from white Southerners' perspective on the part of northern states. And just another area you can see over a bigger picture. So, significations of space during the years after the American Revolution aren't so sharp because, as we said, slavery existed in both. The North isn't the promised land for slaves in the 1780s and 90s. It becomes the promised land in the 19th century in large part because of the Underground Railroad. So in the 1790s, you still have ads in places like Philadelphia for runaway slaves. There's an ad in 1804 from a slave who ran away from Gettysburg to PA. That starts to diminish, where the ads are more and more from about slaves from the South running into the North. And some of those significations, I think, are epitomized by this 1837 map, the moral map of the U.S., put out by the Legion of Liberty. You know, pretty obviously they're depicting the South as this dark, evil place. And that gets reinforced after the Civil War. This is from 1888, the historical geography map, and this originates in Jamestown, and you can see it's a crooked, bent, nasty-looking tree. It says, if you can't read it in the back, God's cursed slavery. This originating in Plymouth Rock, God's blessing liberty. And when you all went to high school, I don't know, I'm probably older. I don't know if I'm older than everybody in this room. You don't have to tell me your age. I'm 50. So when I went to high school, when my wife went to high school, and people of my generation went to high school, there is this kind of perception of the North as good in the Civil War era, because the North was fighting for freedom, and the South as bad. Well, part of the reason we have those conceptions is because of this kind of conception of the spaces of the North and South. And in fact, many people, my wife being one of them, never even knew that slavery existed in the North. And they were shocked to find that out, that where they grew up had slavery. How could that be? But what gets lost in translation, then, in these significations of space, I think, is how these African Americans shape these perceptions that developed. And as the story of the Civil War is translated into a struggle for freedom, and part of that revision that I mentioned at the beginning, part of that revision was, well, the North fought for freedom. The South fought for states' rights. And this is kind of a compromise historians agreed on. When, as you probably know, that wasn't the case at the start of the Civil War. That wasn't the case for either side. So you get people like David Walker. Have you read David Walker's appeal? Who starts to generate this snowballing response and stirs black activism in the North. And as some of you may know, David Walker's appeal, they keep finding it. It keeps popping up in the South. Right? And white elites are quite disturbed by David Walker's appeal popping up in the South. In courts brought there by black sailors, in one case by a white sailor in South Carolina. And they keep suspecting that it's behind some of the insurrections and slave resistance and unrest that's going on there. And so he's starting to generate this snowballing response. And then, of course, you get to Nat Turner, I'll come back to in a minute. Hester and her black allies in the North, Harriet Tubman and all of those who helped her, they get lost in this story. And the question, I think, is why did they get lost in the story? Stories of the Underground Railroad proliferate after the Civil War in the telling of Northerners' involvement, but primarily those stories proliferate about white Northerners' involvement. And David Blight, you all read any of his stuff? He talks about how Americans remember the Civil War. Remember, I went to a symposium he did a few years ago in Cincinnati, and he said if you took all the stories of the Underground Railroad and white Northerners' involvement in the Underground Railroad, if they were all true, the South would have been emptied of slaves before the Civil War started. And that may be an exaggeration, and I don't know if any of you have stories that you've heard in your hometowns or schools or communities that somebody has some funky room in their basement that they think was part. So you've heard.
Oh, yeah.
So what's the story you've heard?
Students say, that their house was there. They had this basement room where people could be hidden, and farms and working in sort of farm towns. This is the essential.
Okay.
And then there's the Robinson House, which is up near Burlington, where I think there's a little bit of documentation.
Yeah. And the National Park Service and some other, they have some very good ways of documenting. And many of those stories are true, but I think far more of them are not true. So in Gettysburg, I don't think we're going to go to it. There's a place called the Dobbin House. It's a restaurant. It's been a restaurant since the late 18th century. And it's it has a nice little downstairs kind of stone tavern downstairs. And actually, the cheap food downstairs is better than the expensive food upstairs, we found. But it has a stairwell, and in that stairwell there's a cubby hole, and it has a plexiglass, and it has a couple of mannequins, African-American, supposed to be African-American mannequins. And supposedly this is where they hid people in the Underground Railroad. Now most of the people, and as I said, I'm not an expert on the mechanics of the Underground Railroad, and I don't pretend to be. There are a lot of people who know far more about it than me. So those people that I've talked to are very skeptical about the Dobbin House being any part of the Underground Railroad. In fact, they were slave owners for quite some time, into the 1820s. But these stories proliferate, because they're exciting stories. I mean, I think it would be cool if I found out my great aunt, was part of the Underground Railroad somehow, helping people out. But the reality is they're more often myth than fact.
How far south did the Underground Railroad start? Where did it start?
All the way into Alabama, Mississippi. There's no limits to it, really. And actually, sometimes we think of the Underground Railroad as just going south to north, which is the vast majority of it. But sometimes it's south to west, or even south to further south, like Florida, where they're going to escape into maroon communities. But most of the escapees are from the border states, is the majority. But there's a significant number from Tennessee, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and often through ports, on board ships, things like that.
Where are there?
There were some in Florida. There were some in the Great Dismal Swamp, which was much bigger then than it is now. Far bigger than it is now. Some remote parts of the Appalachians. You said where, right? Yeah. And if you're unfamiliar, maroon communities, these communities of escaped slaves who sort of form community in remote places, tend not to last a long time in the north. In some places in South America and Central America, Caribbean, especially Jamaica and Brazil. In fact, in Brazil, anybody know the name of the state? It starts with P, can't remember. That's 100 years they had a maroon society there before the Portuguese government finally invaded. Yeah.
Communities where the Seminoles took escaped slaves in, is that considered a maroon community when it's mixed with the Native Americans, or is it just something separate?
That's a good question. I've seen historians refer to them as maroon communities, but that is a unique category. Would you think of them as a maroon community?
No, but they're escaped.
Yeah, that's it.
The maroon communities in North America, are they just blacks? Or are they Native Americans also in other states besides Florida?
So if you have Native Americans who are, some of whom were enslaved, very few, who escape together and form a community, then yeah, I suppose you could call it a maroon community. But often when Native Americans escape, they tend to reconnect with a different American Indian group, or go back to their group of origin. So if you're going to be explicit with terminology, I think I would probably not call those communities maroon communities, or like with the Black Seminole. Well, the Seminoles, or they became known as the Black Seminoles.
Are they not as defined as the ones like down in Jamaica, where they have a colony and they have a treaty and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, but see, here's where I think it gets tricky, because at some point, or like in Palmeiras or in Jamaica, I think at some point, is it still really a maroon community when the colonial authority sort of recognizes and even dealing and negotiating and conducting trade with them, and essentially leaving them alone because they recognize, it actually sort of keeps the peace if we just leave it as is. Then is it still really a maroon community? Historians refer to it that way. I wonder if it needs to be reconceptualized.
Isn't that the epitome of what maroon is? You're so successful at what you do, you just have to, or whoever the person is, has to recognize you as independent.
But once you're independent, are you still a maroon community? I mean, is there an evolution of, so you become a maroon, so you're running away, you're just a few people hanging on, hiding out. Others join you to the point where you can form some kind of community, so then it's a maroon community. Is there then an evolution, in the case of Jamaica or Palmeiras in Brazil, where you're not a state, you're not a political state, you're not a polity, a full-fledged polity perhaps, but you're something more than this kind of loose collection.
Because Britain hired out these Marines in Jamaica to defend the island from Spain, right? War change year 39, all that's going on. So I think you are right, it's something different than what we call Maroons, because they're independent, but now they're moving into a new fold society that's in place.
Yeah.
But what is the word maroon translation?
I think it gets beyond me here. So who is working on a PhD?
Yeah.
So, oh, really? Okay. I'll say there's your niche, so that you can be cutting edge and get a job when you get done. Right? It's like, wow, this guy has reconceptualized how we think in Maroon communities. But that is okay. So here's my attempt at a segue. The free black communities that escaped slaves become a part of are not Maroon communities. They're definitely not, because they're not isolated. They're not illegal communities. They are, and for the most part, they're mixed. Like the free black community in Gettysburg, they do tend to live in one area that we'll go through when you come there, but they're not isolated and legally segregated in certain ways from white community. And these are the communities that escaped slaves frequently become a part of, and why these free black communities are critical. Yeah.
Just, if you don't want to go back to that, but I mean, I just heard about like the Mardi Gras Indians or Creoles that go live with Native Americans.
Yep.
I mean, how, is that a big thing going on, or is that just a myth for this music Mardi Gras purpose? They dress up in those costumes and sort of pay homage to natives, to Native Americans.
Did African Americans or slaves do that? Certainly.
Yeah, I mean, that's.
Yeah, because so one of the.
And that's out of the jurisdictions, in a way, of the government. They're sort of quasi.
So what are quasi-independent?
These Indian communities that are harboring these escapes.
Yeah, because they have their own kind of legal autonomy. That's recognized until the U.S. government decides they don't want to recognize it anymore. They're great treatments, but yeah, because Native Americans they think about race very differently than the kind of racial schematics that evolved in the United States. So absorbing escaped slaves or even free black people who choose to move in those communities is much easier for them, which makes it all the more ironic that some of the Seminoles in Florida have decided that the black Seminoles are not really Seminoles now that it has become an issue of money, who has access to money. So in many ways, the Seminoles in Florida who have decided that are working in contradiction to their historical pattern. Okay, so I tried to segue, but not all right. The black communities in the North are just as critical, I would argue, to thinking about how we reconceptualize and rephrase causality of the Civil War. Because if we're going to say that black people helped cause the Civil War, not just slavery as an institution, it's the people who run away, it's also the people who assist them. And those stories that we hear about, the white Northerners who were involved, many of them true. Abolitionism and anti-slavery doesn't become an agitating factor without white Northerners. But white Northerners come onto the scene late because free black people in the North, they're assisting runaway slaves, and they're abolitionists and immediate abolitionists from the get-go, right, from early on. Although I have to qualify that, there's also a danger in thinking about all free black people in the North as militant abolitionists. They're out there fighting the cause. And they've got jobs, they've got kids, they're trying to survive. For many of them, being an activist, they just don't have time for it. So I think it's a mistake and an oversimplification to perceive every black person as David Walker. But nonetheless, that said, free black communities are absolutely critical in how the Underground Railroad works because they're involved well before white Americans become involved in significant numbers. Right? They're there from the beginning. And then as this becomes more and more an issue, they begin to acquire more white allies, which is absolutely critical. David Blight, by the way, has theorized that the reason that many white Northerners claim connection to the Underground Railroad, which leads to all of these stories about people having tunnels out to the woods. A good friend of mine named Karen James used to work with the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission, has done a lot of work on tunnels, and if you want to see a passionate fire response from a very outspoken black woman, say tunnels to her, she would just go off, because there weren't tunnels. People didn't dig tunnels to help slaves escape. It's impractical, and there's no evidence of them. But at any rate, David Blight theorizes that it's kind of like Vietnam vets, people who claim to be involved in the Vietnam War. And I'm sure we'll see the same thing with the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, where, and again, this is probably a function of my age, but in the 1980s, my dad served 3 tours of Vietnam. In the 1980s and into the 90s, when Vietnam vets were sort of welcomed back into the American bosom, because for a while Vietnam vets were personas non grata. When we welcome them back and have what we kind of do now, where you can honor the troops even if you don't support the war, there were a lot of people claiming to be Vietnam vets who never went to Vietnam, some of whom were never in the military, because it was their way of sort of connecting to this really crucial time, this pivotal time in American history. So David Blight theorizes that for many white Northerners, that was, especially if they didn't fight or they didn't have ancestors who fought, that was their way to connect, say, I played a part in this great battle for freedom, because we were involved in the Underground Railroad, when the reality was they were not, or at most were very peripheral. And you also get into questions of what constitutes involvement in the Underground Railroad. If you're a small black farmer or a white business owner, and somebody shows up on your doorstep because they've been referred there through this network of communications that African Americans had that was often very efficient, and they say, can you hide this person for a night because we know the slave catchers are on their trail? And so if you reluctantly agree, because you're anti-slavery but you're not really abolitionist, but they're right there in your doorstep, how are you going to say no to this man or perhaps a family with small children? So you hide them for a night in your barn and you say, but I'm never doing this again, and they escape successfully. Are you part of the Underground Railroad? Maybe, even though you're not an enthusiastic participant. So one could extend that evolution broadly.
How did the people from the Underground Railroad get rid of the scent of the person?
How did they what?
Get rid of the scent of the person? You know how the bloodhounds would track them and stuff like that. How did they get rid of the scent?
You mean the literal scent, or the?
To where the bloodhounds can't pick up on you.
I'm not a forensic scientist. I do not know. I have no idea how they.
It seemed like the bloodhounds that would show up at the person's house that was hiding in the future.
Yeah, well, but some of this kind of gets into the myth. So I'm perpetuating this myth. So this is a painting.
Eastman Johnson.
Pardon?
Is that Eastman Johnson?
Yeah, thank you. And there you can see there are dogs chasing. These are two. This is the Great Dismal Swamp that they're running through. This man, this woman, and somewhere back there you can make out a hat of a slave catcher. But these dogs are chasing. So the slave catchers did use dogs sometimes, but often, I think more often than not, they didn't use dogs. So, and maybe if we had the way to figure it out, we could try to figure out, well, when they used dogs, did they have a 90% rate of recapture as opposed to when they didn't use dogs? I don't know. But I don't know the science behind that, other than I can tell you, and I'll show you a map in a second, that, well, I'll show it to you now. Let's see. So this is a topographical satellite image of Pennsylvania. Oh, it's not in the, let me see. It's in that PowerPoint somewhere. I forgot my computer wasn't hooked up. Let's see. Yeah, I'll have to email that to you.
As you're looking, can I make a quick announcement just about the David Blight lecture you referred to a
Yeah.
couple times? Is on the Gilder Lehrman website.
Okay.
I have it on my.
Can you post a link to
yeah,
the?
I'm going to pull it up
chat
again.
room?
I downloaded it a couple of months ago, but I'll go find it. post a link to it. It's a good lecture, thoughtful. So it sounds like a similar lecture, similar.
Okay,
yeah.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, it's with the memory of the Civil War, history,
The African Americans, when they're escaping, they use topography. So they follow mountain ridges, streams. And streams would be one way, perhaps, to lose a scent. Although good bloodhounds is not going to fool them; they can pick it up farther upstream. But they use the topography. And so, and one of the things I wanted to show you. So if you look at a satellite image of the mountains, and when you come to Gettysburg, I'll take everyone to the towers and look at this. If you look at the satellite image of the mountains, the Appalachians that flow from north to south, they're just a conduit. They're a natural conduit taking slaves from the south to the north that transgress the boundaries. So you can draw the geographical boundaries of Pennsylvania and Maryland. Well, the mountains, right, they go right through that boundary. So you follow the mountains north, you follow the streams north, and it's an easy way for them to negotiate their journey. And some of these free black communities in Ohio and Pennsylvania, they're located along those ridges and streams. And so it's an easy way for them to connect. Well, I shouldn't say easy. It's doable. And because they're doing that, because they keep running away and they're transgressing these boundaries, reinforcing those boundaries through the law becomes more important. So white Southerners are repeatedly pressing northern states to enforce the federal law, Federal Fugitive Slave Law 1793, and again in 1850, and they become infuriated with things like the personal liberty laws of Pennsylvania, where Pennsylvania says, you can come catch them, but we are going to tell our law enforcement officials they are not allowed to help you, that it's illegal for our law enforcement officials to help you. So white slave owners see this as a contravention of federal law. And and they want the federal law enforced. And this is one of the reasons why I would argue, and I'm not, there are several other historians much more prominent than myself who have pointed this out, that when we say that southern states were seceded because of states' rights, that they were resisting the growing power of a centralized federal government, the problem with that is the southern states were quite happy with the federal power when they controlled it. When they lost control of it, or when they perceived the federal government wasn't enforcing its power, wasn't using its power to enforce these kind of laws, that's when they were unhappy with the centralized federal government. So the states' rights argument is a bit misleading, and when my students bring that up, I say, well, what's the primary right they were looking to protect? To own human property. Yeah.
And so to add to that, they have the slaveocracy with the 3/5 compromise only contributing to a greater representation in the House and in the presidency historically. So they've had that federal power in an undue and unfair way based on human bondage.
Yeah, we all like power when we wield it. Right?
Do we have numbers? I guess I'm a visual person is trying to amass how many slaves used the Underground Railroad.
Yeah, excellent question. So let me skip ahead here. I'll come back. No, I'll come back to this. So this is stuff I already mentioned, because I was going to end with Nat Turner there, but actually, this guy J.B.D. DeVoe became superintendent of census. He had previously run this journal, which was an apologist for slavery, and he quit because he wanted to show slavery is really fairly benign because see hardly any of them run away. And so his estimates were that about 1,500 slaves ran away a year, which seems low. So John Hope Franklin Schweniger, this is what they have come up with. About 50,000 runaways a year. But remember, this is runaways. This isn't escaping slaves. This is all runaways. So it's far more than J.D.B. DeVoe the way he tried to spin the census.
And once again, runaway is I could be staying out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So this 50,000, the people who are escaping is a much smaller number. So this is now. I'm not sure if this is going to work. It worked before. Yeah, so before I had this all rigged up so that I clicked and this bar rose slowly, so it's very dramatic. But so this is 1860. There's about 4 million slaves in 1860, right? So this isn't all slaves who lived from 1820 to 1860. So this is actually, the dimensions would be even greater, or the disparity even greater. So this is how many ran, not escaped, ran. And so this is how many don't run. So the vast majority of slaves don't run away. Oh, no, this is the problem I had. I don't know why it's doing this. So 50,000 a year sounds like a lot, but it's a small percentage. So escaped slaves, 1860, this is how many run away, or how many slaves there are in 1860. Over a 40-year period, this is how many try to escape. That's not even successful escapes. So the best estimates that Franklin, Schwenninger, and others have come up with is you're looking at maybe a couple of thousand a year try to escape. Most escapees are not successful. And ultimately, escaping slaves pose no economic threat to the institution of slavery. If slave owners had just let them go, not bothered to chase them down, it would have had other ramifications because probably more slaves would have escaped. But in terms of economically, it's not like they're taking a big hit, that it's going to destroy the institution of slavery as an economic or political force because you got a couple of thousand out of millions who are actually escaping. Yeah.
So, what historical document people look at to see exactly, to see the details of who escaped, how long they stayed gone, and were they just trying to see a girl on another plantation, or were they just really trying to get away? I mean, how do they distinguish that?
No, that's excellent question too. Some of it is the stories that gets passed down, court reports, and legal documents are a great source. Newspaper ads are critical, which I have one of here somewhere. This is all more of the legal stuff. Let's see. Oh, there you go. So you get newspaper ads like this quite a bit. And there are some historians who've done incredible work. And in fact, I think there's an online database now with many of these that if I find it, I will send you a link for that as well. And actually what I like about this ad is, this is 1837, my Negro woman Betsy Merrick, first and last name unusual, her 3 children, dark complexion, her children are mulattoes, so that might suggest what? Yeah, perhaps the slave owner is a father. Not necessarily, but good chance. She's running away with the infant. So this is an unusual woman because most of the runaways, most of the escaping slaves are men between ages 18 and mid to late 30s. But there are a significant number of women. Usually they're not running with children, but that does happen. So she's running with three children, one of whom is an infant. So, so I would read into this, these are dire circumstances that are forcing her to, or not forcing, but leading her to make this decision. And the other part of this, so he's offering a reward and also an extra sum of $30 for the conviction of any white person or persons harboring them. So this guy wants to go not after just Betsy Merrick, but anybody who's trying to help her. And perhaps, and I'm not sure to what extent W.A. Langdon was aware of this, but she's probably more likely to be helped by black people than white people in the South, but certainly was possible.
What was the name of that Pennsylvania law that you mentioned? Where the
Personal liberty law?
Personal liberty.
Yeah.
How long?
Go ahead, well, Christine? Christine.
What kind of statistics do you have for the successful runaways? Because I've heard very different things.
Okay, I don't have the stats here. I don't recall. And
On average, like you have, because I mean, we were, what was it, the other day we were at the library company, and she said that, what, 90% of the
90% will return.
they were not successful.
Yeah.
And then in the article that we were reading before, talking about Ruggles, he said that about a third of them succeeded. So
Yeah.
33% and 10% is a big difference in success rate of people that, successfully.
And I'm leery. One, because I have tried to studiously stay away from the mechanics of the Underground Railroad. So I haven't done my own research to figure out the statistical success rate. And part of the reason I haven't done it is because I'm not sure it's possible that you can really hammer down. I think, and going back to the question of sources, I think what you can get from sources is patterns and a general picture. And that pattern and picture, everything I've read is kind of that same range, that it seems to be somewhere between 60 to 70%, and some people estimate as high as 90% are caught and returned. I think 90% is a little high. My impression from what I read in the primary sources, it seems to be more of them succeed in that, but that's just an impression. It would just be a tremendous amount of research and time to try and track down all the cases that we know of. And that's a key caveat, that's the cases that we know of. So the ones we don't know of, people who are caught, taken back, or succeed, that just don't get into the legal documents or newspapers, I'm not sure how to factor that. But you could go for a median and say a quarter, 20-25%.
How long does a slave have to belong before they consider you trying to escape?
I'm not sure. That's a good question. I haven't thought about that. I'm not sure I'd put a length of time as much as what's the intent of the person running away, and perhaps what kinds of things do they do and what direction do they head. So if they're running to another plantation to see family, there's clearly not much intent to escape. If they're running hundreds of miles away, so if a slave from Mississippi is caught in Kentucky, they're probably trying to escape. So going back a bit here. And thinking about how to tell a different story in situating black agency. One of the things that I do, this isn't connected so much to the Underground Railroad as, and I haven't talked as much about these free black towns and black Northerners' familiarity with the law. You wanted me to end about 10:30, right? So who's on the $20 bill? Yeah, that's my $20 bill. Currently, it's Andrew Jackson. So I've done this with my classes at Gettysburg every year, sometime where it's a, say I want to submit a petition to the Treasury Department to take off Andrew Jackson and put on Nat Turner. And I have my students do a debate, and they have to make some postings online. And sometimes I force them to take one side or the other. Sometimes I tell them they can take. When I tell them to take whatever side you want, I usually out of 25 students, I usually get like 2 who will be on this side, and the rest who are on the opposing side. And they often want to say, well, how about Harriet Tubman or Martin Luther King? And I say, no, because they're too easy. Right? We all love them. We've got people on our money with blood on their hands. So why not somebody black with blood on their hands? And you know, I mean, Nat Turner, I can't say I approve of all the things he did, but if the people on our money are icons and symbols that represent how we want to think of ourselves as a nation, then I would argue Nat Turner and Nat Turner's Rebellion, which we don't know if he was influenced by David Walker, although some theorized at the time that he was. He's certainly in the minds of many white Southerners as possible. White Southerners don't think that when slaves rebel, they're going to line up in neat military lines like a good army, a respectable army would do, that they're sneaky, right, because of the evolving racial ideology of the time. So these black folks are sneaky. They're going to come in the night, they're going to kill your women and your children. And that's what Nat Turner does. So he's their worst nightmare manifested. And he and his band cause a ripple effect all out of proportion to what they actually achieved, because they kill somewhere between 40 and 60 white people. And again, I'm not endorsing, because some of them were pretty, they killed women and children. One of his lieutenants bashed a baby's head against a tree. I'm not endorsing any of that. But the reality is, we could describe Nat Turner as a freedom fighter. We call him a rebel, so he's rebelling for freedom, as were the escaping slaves. He causes a ripple effect all out of proportion to what he actually achieves. Because if you've read Confessions of Nat Turner and other accounts of it, it's not a very well organized or very well led rebellion. Logistically, it wasn't very well managed. It lasts for 2 days. He escapes and is gone for 6 weeks before they finally catch him and execute him. And the effect, though, through the South is tremendous, where you have a hardening of racial lines, of racial restrictions. Slavery gets harsher for African Americans after Nat Turner. There are white people in Louisiana, who are afraid that Nat Turner is going to show up there in those 6 weeks while he's gone and cause another rebellion. Because slavery gets harsher, slaves running away becomes a bigger deal. It's already snowballing before Nat Turner, and it just takes off more so. And there's other factors in this too. It's not just about Nat Turner escaping slaves, there's a host of other things, but I would argue Nat Turner is a seminal, pivotal figure in American history, and in many ways representative of these thousands of black men and women who are running away for over a 40, 50-year period that just keep ratcheting up the tensions that lead the nation to war, which is eventually results in a changed nation and emancipation.
So, if he has this, that rebellion has this ripple effect, would you classify it as unsuccessful?
Good question. So it was, I guess I'd say it was unsuccessful in that he did not achieve his immediate goals. But was it successful? Maybe I had difficulties with the word success.
Well, it was part of a larger struggle.
Yeah.
Would you say it was successful in that context of a larger struggle, a more protracted historical struggle? Since it did affect so much of the United States and the perception, but then some people might say, well, slavery got more harsh, so that it was a bad thing, but in fact, that's just what happens. Sometimes you have to, you have to create that tension to really truly advance.
Yeah, and actually, there were some black folks, slaves, after Nat Turner, who were angry at him because it made their lives worse, and some who saw him as a hero. But it sounds like, would you argue that it was successful ultimately?
I would. When you consider it long term or in a part of a larger context, I say yes. But even though he may not have achieved what he specifically wanted, but then I wonder, like, how do we know what his specific intentions were?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Well, because we hear his voice through Thomas Gray, through somebody else, so he may have had larger goals like that. That's a good point. I don't know. In terms of the word success, they were getting hung up on. I would absolutely say it had it shaped the country. Shaped the country then in 1831 and for decades afterwards. Just like Washington, Lincoln, all these other people who put on our money. So I had my students a couple of times actually go out and circulate a petition through the college and see how many signatures they could get. But I have never actually sent it into the training department. So maybe we all do this, several thousand. But primarily I use it as a tool to get my students to think about who we define as heroes, why, and what it says about us as a country. And to connect to these issues about escaping slaves as well, and seeing them as critical to that.
Professor?
Yeah.
Is that rebellion reinforcing those boundaries, that conception of space that we've been talking about? And is the South perceiving this rebellion as, I know you said you may or may not have listened to David Walker, but is there this idea that this is agitation from the North somehow, or
They're
reinforcing,
yes.
reinforcing those boundaries?
Yeah, actually, I hadn't thought about that, and that I'll have to write that down, because that would be actually a really good question for me to think about in terms of, I hadn't thought about that connection.
Repeat the question?
Because, well,
Is this not Turner's
Yeah.
Rebellion reinforcing those boundaries, creating this idea of space and those boundaries between North and South?
Right.
Because the South is perceiving that as being, a northern agitation. We did talk about perhaps Walker. They were thinking that that Turner was possibly influenced by David Walker.
Yeah.
So is it just that that could be fleshed out a bit more?
Yeah, it's possible because like Virginia's governor and some other white political elites, they do raise the question of if white abolitionists or Walker or other Northerners have been involved in this agitation and are afraid of it. But I haven't really thought about that connection, which I'm not sure how far that spreads. A couple of this is 10:33, so let me just, I'll wrap up in 2 minutes here. A couple of things also for you to, food for thought. So we refer to the Confederacy as the rebels, the Johnny Rebs, the soldiers. I would argue they are fighting to preserve a way of life that has existed for thousands of years, right, in forced bondage. Thus, they are not rebels. They're preservationists. But the real rebels in the Civil War are black troops. You're talking about the largest black rebellion in world history other than perhaps Haiti, where you've got 200,000 soldiers and sailors fighting for emancipation and making them and others helping to make the war a war for emancipation, which, as you know, the North is initially fighting to preserve the Union, not to emancipate the slaves. And thus, perhaps rethinking, reconceptualizing how we think about the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, and all civil rights legislation since then. Stokely Carmichael in 1966, and I'll send Rich the audio clip. In 1966, he makes a speech at UC Berkeley. This is after he's come out with what we want now is Black Power. That was 64. And this speech in Berkeley, so I'll send you the clip and you start listening about 5 minutes in. It's an hour-long speech, and you listen for about 3 or 4 minutes. He says about civil rights legislation in the 1960s that no civil rights legislation was ever passed for black people. And his point is civil rights legislation is for white people. Because he says, I know I'm free. I know I have the right to move where I want to move, to live where I want to live, to go eat where I want to eat. It's white people who didn't know that. And so civil rights legislation, he says, is for them, to tell them they can't prevent us from doing what we know we can do. And so in some ways, I would argue the Emancipation Proclamation, you could apply what Stokely Carmichael says to the same thing. Black people know they are free, and they're saying this. David Walker says it. They're saying it in the 1780s, they're saying it in the 1790s, in 1829, in the 1840s. They're saying, we know we're free, we know we have rights. It's that we're being prevented from exercising those. So the Emancipation Proclamation, the Civil War, I think we tend to think of it sometimes. I hear this from when I do talk with, like public talks, or even from my students, that, well, the nation did enough for black people. The nation fought a war where 600,000 people died to free black people. I would say, no, the nation didn't do that for black people. That's a misconception of why the Civil War was fought and what these kind of seminal events and seminal legislation was for in American history. So, what do you want to do? Q&A? More Q&A?
Let's take a break. That's a lot to think about, and I want you all to join me in thanking Scott Hancock for giving us